Good morning, Virgo. Thanks for being here today. I hope you're doing well. Um, okay, there is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a person who has stopped expecting something they once wanted deeply. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the other kind, the kind that settles in after hope has been quietly set down, not abandoned dramatically, not surrendered with any ceremony, but simply placed somewhere out of reach because carrying it had become too heavy. And some of you know exactly the kind of silence I'm describing. You've been living inside it for a while now, telling yourself it's fine, telling yourself you've moved on, telling yourself the door is closed and you've made your peace with that. But something brought you here today, and that something is worth paying attention to. Okay, so let's get started, Virgo. A theme that surfaces strongly in this reflection is the energy of something unresolved that has been waiting, not passively, not inertly, but with a kind of quiet insistence for the right conditions to finally break through. There are emotional truths that exist between people that resist being permanently buried. They get covered over. They go silent for long stretches of time. They allow both parties to move through their lives with the comfortable fiction that the unspoken thing has simply dissolved. But it hasn't. And many of you, in the quieter moments late at night, in the pause between one thought and the next, have felt that truth still present, still there, like a frequency that never fully stopped transmitting, even when no one was openly listening. What's being reflected here is the energy of a confession. And I want to hold that word carefully because confession doesn't always mean what the dramatic version of it suggests. It isn't always a declaration made under crisis or pressure. Sometimes a confession is simply the moment when someone finally stops pretending to themselves and then to you that what they feel isn't what it is. That the thing they've been minimizing, rationalizing, or quietly suffocating under layers of pride or fear or self protection is actually real, has always been real, and has perhaps been more persistent than either of them wanted to admit. A pattern that sometimes emerges in situations like this is that the person holding the unexpressed truth has been engaged in a very private kind of struggle, one that isn't visible from the outside, one that may have looked from your perspective like indifference, like distance, like someone who simply moved on without difficulty, without looking back, without carrying any of what you carried. But an energy that may be present here suggests that the appearance of ease isn't always the reality of it. That sometimes the people who seem most settled in their silence are the ones doing the most interior work to maintain it. The composed exterior and the quiet interior are not always the same landscape, and what looks like resolution from a distance sometimes reveals itself up close to be something far more unfinished. There is a kind of emotional archaeology that people sometimes engage in, privately sifting through what happened, what was said, what was never said, what might have gone differently if one conversation had taken a different turn. And a theme appearing here is that this kind of quiet internal excavation may have been happening for someone in your life far more recently than you might assume. Not as obsession, not as an inability to move forward, but as the slow, honest work of a person trying to understand something that mattered more to them than they were willing to admit at the time. This reflection invites you to consider whether the version of this person you've been carrying in your mind, the one who seemed unbothered, the one who seemed to have moved past it cleanly, was ever fully accurate, or whether that image was partly a story you told yourself to make the distance more bearable. There's something that happens in the human psyche when a truth has been suppressed for a significant amount of time. It doesn't become smaller, it tends to become more concentrated, more distilled, until it reaches a kind of critical density where the energy required to continue containing it begins to exceed the energy required to simply release it. And an energy that may be present in this moment is exactly that threshold being approached, that quiet internal tipping point where continued silence starts to feel more costly than the vulnerability of speaking. Some of you may have experienced a version of this yourself, the way a feeling held long enough in secret begins to feel almost too large for the container you've been keeping it in. The way honesty, even when terrifying, can begin to feel like relief before it even arrives. That's the kind of internal pressure that often precedes a confession. Not anger, not desperation. Something quieter and more inevitable, like a tide that has simply reached the point where it must move. Here's the thing about words that have been held back for a long time. When they finally arrive, they don't always sound the way you imagined they would in your quieter moments of wondering. They don't always come wrapped in perfect clarity or delivered at a perfect moment. Sometimes they arrive haltingly. Sometimes they arrive sideways, buried inside a conversation that starts somewhere else entirely. Sometimes they arrive as something small, a single sentence, a gesture, a moment of unexpected honesty that carries the weight of everything that was never said before it. And recognizing that kind of communication requires a particular quality of attention, a willingness to hear not just the words, but what the words are carrying. What's also worth understanding is that the person approaching this moment of honesty may not be fully aware of how significant it is. They may frame it minimally. They may offer it with a kind of casualness that feels designed to give them an exit if the response isn't what they hoped for. This is a very human form of self-protection. The half-open door, the confession that could technically be walked back if necessary, and an energy that may be present here is the importance of creating enough safety in the exchange that the full truth has room to arrive, rather than retreating behind its own protective casing the moment it senses resistance. A theme appearing here is the concept of pride as a barrier. Not pride in the healthy, self-respecting sense, but the more fragile kind. The kind that builds walls not out of strength, but out of fear. The fear of being seen, wanting something. The fear of being the one who admitted they were wrong, or that they missed something, or that they underestimated what was actually present in a connection. This kind of pride is one of the most common reasons true things go unsaid for so long. And part of what may be shifting now for someone in your life is a quiet loosening of that particular defense. A recognition, perhaps arrived at slowly and privately, that the protection the wall was offering has started to cost more than it's worth. A pattern that sometimes emerges at this stage is a kind of testing behavior, small reaches, indirect acknowledgments, messages that seem casual but carry a carefully concealed intention, moments of contact that could be explained away as nothing, but that feel to someone paying close attention like something, like someone checking whether the door is still open before they commit to walking through it. And some of you may have already been noticing this, may have been telling yourself you're reading too much into it. But an energy present in this reflection gently suggests that your instincts in this particular situation may be more reliable than your doubt. This reflection invites you to consider what you would do, how you would actually respond in your body and in your actions if the thing you stopped allowing yourself to hope for suddenly became real. And whether there's any preparation, emotional or otherwise, that feels important to do now in the quiet before it arrives. There's a particular emotional texture to this moment that I want to name carefully. Because for many of you, the idea of receiving a confession, of finally hearing the thing you thought you'd never hear, arrives tangled with other feelings that aren't simply joy. There's relief, possibly, but there's also something more complicated, the grief of all the time that passed in silence, the quiet anger, perhaps, of having spent so long in uncertainty that could have been resolved sooner, the disorientation of a narrative you'd already written, a particular ending for suddenly being rewritten. And an energy that may be present here is the importance of allowing all of those feelings to coexist, not collapsing into any single one of them, not deciding in advance what the arrival of this truth means for what comes next. There's also, and this is worth naming directly, a tenderness that surfaces when something you had buried comes back into the light. A tenderness for the version of yourself that waited, that hoped quietly in the dark, that kept the smallest ember of something alive even while insisting to everyone, perhaps even to yourself, that it had long since gone cold. That version of you deserves gentleness right now, not pity, not judgment for having held on, simply a kind of deep, unhurried compassion for the fact that caring about something real is always costly and that you paid that cost without anyone necessarily knowing you were paying it. Because here is what's worth understanding. A confession, even a long awaited one, is not an ending, it's a beginning. Or more precisely, it's an opening, a moment where something that was closed becomes available, where a conversation that was frozen begins to thaw. What happens after that opening depends entirely on choices that haven't been made yet, on conversations that haven't been had, on clarity that can only arrive once both people are standing in the same honest space and deciding together what they actually want to build from it. This reflection invites you to consider what you genuinely want from this, not what would feel validating in the short term, not what would ease the discomfort of the waiting, but what would actually feel true and nourishing for the version of your life you are trying to build now. And this is where it gets subtle, because one of the more complex emotional patterns that sometimes emerges in situations like this is the tendency to respond to a long awaited truth with either an immediate yes or an immediate pulling away. Both of those reflexes, while completely understandable, can sometimes move faster than the actual processing that the moment deserves. A theme appearing here is the value of slowness, of receiving what comes without immediately deciding what to do with it, of allowing the truth to simply exist in the space between you for a moment before any decisions are made about its implications. This reflection invites you to consider what it would mean to receive this confession from a place of genuine internal stability rather than from a place of longing or pain or the need to resolve discomfort quickly, and what conditions, internal or external, would support that kind of groundedness in you. Um, there's also a shadow side to this reflection that deserves to be acknowledged, because not every confession is a resolution. Not every truth, when finally spoken, lands in the way we imagined it would during all the time we spent waiting for it. Sometimes what someone reveals changes the picture significantly, and not always in the direction of more closeness. Sometimes a confession clarifies something that needed clarifying, even if that clarity is painful. And an energy that may be present here is the importance of remaining genuinely open to whatever truth arrives, including the possibility that what is revealed may be more nuanced, more complicated, or more surprising than the version of it that has been living in your imagination. A pattern that sometimes surfaces in moments of long deferred honesty is that both people are changed by the time the truth finally arrives. The person who needed to speak and the person who needed to hear have both traveled some distance since the moment when the unexpressed thing first became significant. And part of the quiet work of this particular threshold is the recognition that what is being confessed may need to be received by who you are now, not by who you were when you first began waiting for it. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, can make an enormous difference in how clearly you're able to see what you're actually being offered. A theme worth sitting with here is what it means to have waited for something without fully realizing you were still waiting for it, because some of you closed that door consciously, made the decision to release the expectation, filed it away under things that were not meant to be, and yet here you are, which suggests that some part of you, quieter and perhaps more honest than the part that made the decision to let go, never entirely stopped listening for the sound of that door opening again. That isn't weakness. That isn't a failure to heal. That's simply the nature of a connection that carried genuine weight. Real things don't fully disappear just because we decide to stop looking at them. This reflection invites you to consider what part of you has been quietly keeping the door unlocked, and whether honoring that part of yourself might be one of the most honest things you could do right now, regardless of what arrives next. An energy that may be present in this moment is a kind of permission. Permission to acknowledge that you still care about the outcome of this, even if caring about it has felt uncomfortable or inconvenient or at odds with the version of yourself you've been trying to inhabit. Caring doesn't make you fragile, it makes you honest. And honesty, even the private kind that exists only inside your own chest, is always a more stable foundation than the performance of indifference. The energy closing this reflection is one of quiet, almost fragile possibility. Something that has been dormant beginning to stir, something that was sealed beginning to find its edges. A truth that has lived too long in the dark, beginning to sense, perhaps for the first time in a while, that the conditions outside may finally be different enough to bear its weight. And you, whatever you're feeling right now, whatever mixture of hope and protectiveness and tired resignation and secret longing is present in you, you are allowed to feel all of it. You are not required to arrive at this moment with any particular emotional posture. You are not required to be ready. You are not required to have already decided what you want. What you are allowed to do is simply be present for what is unfolding, to stay close enough to your own truth that when someone else's truth finally arrives, you'll know how to meet it not with performance, not with the version of yourself that was built to survive the silence, but with the genuine, unguarded, quietly courageous self that has been waiting in its own way just as long. Some things take the time they take. Some words travel a long road before they find their voice. And when they arrive, however they arrive, they tend to carry something that was worth the waiting. Trust what you feel when the silence finally breaks. That feeling will know more than any outside voice ever could.